We're going to begin as soon as everyone sits down. Please make your way to your seats and we will begin the next talk. That works every time. Make your way to your seats. Our next presentation is going to be a recording from our presenter, and then after the recording, he will actually take a brief moment to say hello virtually via Skype. This next speaker is one of our beloved pastors from the 80s. I give you Father Couture.
Of the Immaculate Conception Church, that I would like to provide a personal testimony of my short 3 years of these long 50 years of grace in Post Falls, 1984, 1987. I wish I could be there bodily with you on this day, but Divine Providence has decided otherwise. So be it. That will be done. I'm nevertheless pleased to be able, thanks to Father Griego's skilled technicians, to be present through this video recording. Our story in Post Falls is that of the grain of mustard seed that becomes a tree where the birds of the air come and build their nests. The story is a homage to the holy sacrifice of the Mass, to the power of God's grace enclosed in that pearl of great price, the hidden treasure, the Holy Mass. All the life enclosed in that liturgical ceremony, these humble 30 minutes of prayers of Latin and silence. The whole of Christian civilization is there. Just give it time, light, that is charity, and water, that is grace, and it will perform wonders. On September 23rd, 1979, in Paris, before a crowd of 20,000 people, Archbishop Lefebvre recalled the fruits of the Holy Mass he saw in his years as a missionary in Africa. I quote, "I have seen this grace at work in Africa. There is no reason why it will not work as well here in these countries." End of quote. This is a truth of faith which applies here at Immaculate Conception Church in Post Falls, Idaho. Jake and Catherine have recalled with great skill the history of Post Falls and of our parish before 1984. I would like to add just a few words on that period. Father de Bichère offered a full traditional Mass, first in his home in the valley, the first Mass for 4 people in 1969. Then at the old Immaculate Conception Church from November 72 onwards. Contacts were eventually made with the Society of St. Pius X that was rapidly growing throughout the USA. From about 1979, Society priests started to come to Post Falls from various priories, mainly from Phoenix, Arizona. Father Douglas Laudenschlager was ordained in 1980 and started to come on a regular basis from Phoenix, where he was stationed with Father Terence Finnegan. At the request of Father de Bichère, very eager to retire, Post Falls thus officially became a society chapel. By 1982, the superiors decided to open a priory in Post Falls. A priory that would become the base for the apostolate of the whole Northwest, Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon. Alaska would join in a few years later. Father Douglas Laudenschlager became the first prior. If I were to summarize these first 15 years, I would say that it all began with the love of an old priest for the true Mass, the Mass of his ordination, and his decision to stick to it. As our Blessed Lord said, where the body is, there the eagles shall gather. This holy mass attracted some faithful in growing numbers. It was said at first in a private chapel in the basement of a house. Then a small church and some land were purchased. A little school opened. The committee agreed to associate with the Society of St. Pius X and not with other groups. And finally a priory was opened with one resident priest. The kingdom of God is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which is the least indeed of all seeds. But when it is grown up, it is greater than all herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and dwell in the branches thereof. That's post-falls. Let us move on now to the second part, from August 28, 1984 to August 27, 1987, the first memorable 3 years of my priesthood. One of the great apostolic principles of our dear founder, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, was to follow providence, not to precede it. That is so true for us priests of the society, although it can happen to anyone. Take St. Francis Xavier, for example. He was not on the list of the missionaries appointed by St. Ignatius in the Kingdom of Portugal to go to India from Portugal in 1541. But he got on it at the last moment to replace one of the Jesuit fathers who got terribly sick and could not leave. Divine providence. Well, in the spring of 1984, I was not the happy nominee to come to Post Falls when deacons were given their first assignment a few months before the ordination for the following summer. In that first appointment in mid-April 1984, I was assigned to go to St. Louis, Missouri. A few days later, talking on the phone to the general bursar, the then Father Bernard Fillet, I asked him who was paying for my travels to St. Louis. Deacons don't have much money. Surprised, he said, "Oh, did they not tell you?" I said, "No, what? You're not going to St. Louis. You're going to Atlanta, where we're planning to open a priory." Still, that did not answer my question. Well, St. Joseph. But it was not going to be Atlanta. Providence was going to intervene in difficult ways, so to speak. A few weeks later, in mid-May, during an evening recreation at the seminary, I was called to the rector's office to be informed of a drama that had just happened in the US. Of the 4 priests ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre on May 3rd, in Richfield, Connecticut, 3 had just left the society 10 days after their ordination. We were then in the spring of 1984, a year after the tragic breakaway of 9 out of 15 priests who were then, in 1983, in the whole of the US district. Now there are about 100 priests in the US. This was such a shock that even Father Schmidberger, our Superior General, did not know how to announce it to the Archbishop, for fear he would have a heart attack. As a result, human plans had to change, and Divine Providence sent me from the southeast to the beautiful northwest to replace one of these 3 priests that had been assigned to Post Falls and had left. Et voila, Post Falls, here we come. I had to look on the map where Post Falls is, where I can no clue. On Tuesday, August 28, 1984, I arrive at Geiger Field International Airport, GEG, Spokane, as they say in Canada, on now defunct Cascade Airways, coming from Montreal and Calgary. Father Laudenschlager came to pick me up and introduced me to the pastures where the Divine Shepherd wanted me to feed this portion of his flock for a too short 3 years. I remember a tiny anecdote of that very first night. I mention it to show you the maternal soul of Archbishop Lefebvre for his seminarians and priests. He was truly a father. That very first night, I went to bed early in my new home, that little brick house at 619 East 4th Avenue, there at the corner. At about 8:45 p.m., when I was already deep asleep because of the 3 hours jet lag, the phone rang. It was an old black phone that, honestly, sounded like the angel's trumpet at the last day. So loud it was. It was there on the L-shaped desk just next to my head, next to my bed. And when it rang, I jumped like a spring in the pitch dark and tried to grab the receptor. But Father Lauderdale on the other room was quicker. Then, as I was slumping back in bed, I hit the square corner of the desk just above my right eye. I remember going to the mirror to see the mark of the wound, an inch above the right eye, and that tiny drop of blood. A good start in the apostolic field, I thought to myself. Deo gracias. But it also threw light on a little detail of the seminarian's room in the seminary in Econ. There, on the bottom shelf, just next to the head of our beds, the corner shelf was cut at an angle. It had never caught my attention. Our paternal founder had foreseen the possibility of his boys getting hurt during the night. He was right. It can really hurt. In the following days, Father explained to me my various duties, plans he had to develop the apostolate. My very first Sunday was for Boise, Idaho. Mass at the Holiday Inn, I think. At the same time, we are in early September 1984, Pope John Paul II came to Canada. And this had an immediate impact on post-falls. Yes. Father Yves Normandin had been kicked out of his Montreal parish in the cold winter of January 1976 because of his return to the traditional Mass. You can read his fantastic book, A Pastor Out in the Cold, which was reprinted recently by Angelus Press. Beautiful story. Father Normandin then started to celebrate Mass throughout Canada, literally from coast to coast, from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, by plane, train, bus, sang Masses between bus stops at any hour of day or night for the last 8 years, from 1976 to 1984. He had actually been awaiting 1984 for the priestly ordination of the first 3 Canadians in Econ, 2 of which had been his altar boy, and I had serviced Mass a few times. Unfortunately, with the visit of the Pope, he had a moment of weakness, probably due to his fatigue, 8 years of incredible travel. And in early September '84, he returned to his Diocese of Montreal, although still holding on to the old Mass. Before going any further, let me say that in the year 2000, Father Normandin came back to the Society. He died 2 years ago on December 30th, 2020, age 95. God rest his soul. And post-falls and all that, well, we got a call from Father Lenné, who heard of Father Normandin going back to Montreal. Father Lenné was then the U.S. District Superior. He was asking us to replace Father Normandin in British Columbia, since Post-Falls was the nearest priory. Father Violette, another newly ordained Canadian priest who's now in Richfield, had just been assigned in Kitchener, near Toronto, and Vancouver was a little too far for Sunday Mass. It's like residing in Buffalo and offering Sunday Mass in Seattle. Naturally, Father Laudenschlager asked me to go to the Canucks for a weekend in mid-September, just before he went on his annual vacation. Allow me to mention at this point what I would call the fulfillment of a little prophecy of our dear Archbishop Lefebvre. Back in northern Switzerland, during the Easter vacation of 1981, I was visiting Father Dennis Rock, the Swiss District Superior, in our Priory of Reichenbach, not too far from Zurich. The Archbishop was there at that moment. Easter time, in the Society of St. Pius X, is a time when superiors intensively discuss the assignments of future priests and reassignments of new old ones. I was only a seminarian, halfway through my 3rd year at a seminary. At one point of the discussion, towards the end of the meal, the Archbishop turned to me. I was seated on his left, and he said, and you, where do you want to go after your ordination? Incredible question, as I still had 3.5 years of training to undergo. So, well, Your Grace, I'm not the one to decide. Wherever you want. He said, not Quebec. Mom is there. Vancouver will be better. Says, well, whatever. Lo and behold, 3.5 years later, I became the priest in charge of Vancouver as a newly ordained priest, and my guardian angel reminded me of these words I had completely forgotten. Amazing. Back in Post Falls from Vancouver the following Tuesday, I was ready to face the apostolate, alone for 1 month, during the vacation of my prior. 1 month became 2 months, and the news finally came that Father Laudenschlager was not going to come back. He had decided to leave the Society of St. Visitans. My dear faithful, pray for your priest. Never take a priest for granted. We are weak. We need prayers and sacrifices. St. Teresa of the Child Jesus knew it, who, having done that famous pilgrimage to Rome for her vocation, she lived in close quarters with priests and saw their human side. Her reaction was not one of scandal, nor of criticism, but rather the reaction of a Christian and of a saint. I will enter Carmel to pray for priests. Now I know they need my prayers even more than I ever thought. And dear faithful, believe in the power of prayer. Oh yes. In the last 5 years, one society priest who had been away 20 years from the practice of his priesthood came back to the society. And another one, more recently, this year, gone for 30 years, is now back in one of our priories, wearing the cassock. And please God, in the next year, he will start saying Mass again. Incredible miracles of the power of prayer. And his latest prodigal son had always kept a spiritual bouquet that Society Sisters had sent to him at one point in the history, in the past. They had gathered it 17 years previously during the girls' camp, telling the girls to pray for a soul that needed much help. It bore fruit 17 years later. Oh yes, believe in the power of prayer. Before looking at the apostolate of these 3 years, I'm just starting. Remember, we're still in the first 2 months. I have to tell you yet of another event in Post Falls. Chris Wisniewski, who must be there today among you, is a witness, and I'm sure she will recall. I went to perform my very first funeral in the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington State in late October, around the 20th of October, for an acquaintance of her brother John. There had been an early snow that day, and on my way back across the Indian forest, driving that super 1972 Chevy Nova, for me a great car, I lost control of the car and went into a 30-foot ditch, head on a big tree, at about 35 miles an hour. Thank God my guardian angel protected me. And I came out through the window and up the road with only a tiny little scratch on a knuckle. It's still there. About an hour later, just as the tow truck was pulling the car out, the car was up in the air, Chris and her brother Jan were arriving on the scene. They were sure I was dead. Well, I was not. I'm talking to you today, 38 years later. They say that the first assignment of a priest marks him for life. Well, his first 2 months were quite exciting for a young 24-year-old priest. And as you can see, they have left an indelible mark 38 years later. Let us now look at the apostolate of these 3 years. Here, however, my memory is not as clear, but I will try to remember as much as I can. In Post Falls, we had the old little church bought in 1972. We have a tiny teacher's house just on the gospel side of the church, on the east side of the church, and the school was held in the basement. I reckon there were about 250, 300 faithful coming to Mass on Sunday. I don't recall ever counting them. If good Joe Malloy was here today, God rest her soul, and that of her dear husband, Leonard, she would know. She knew everything. But we had two Masses on Sunday, something like a 7 a.m. low Mass and a 9 a.m. sung Mass. A regular feature of the 7 a.m. low Mass came from St. Mary's, Idaho, 60 miles away. Good old Joe Roman was always in front of the church at 6 a.m. with his pickup and sick wife, God rest them both, even if there had fallen 3 feet of snow. And I, who lived 100 yards away, could never beat them being the first at church on Sunday morning. Remember that Post Falls was to be a center for the SSPX apostolate in the Northwest. As I make the list of these Mass centers, I just can't remember how, at least for the first 15 months, I managed. There was Corpus Christi Church in Edmonds, in Seattle, north of Seattle, with every Sunday Mass, early afternoon, around 1:30 p.m. And then there was an evening Mass, either in Boise, Idaho, at the Holiday Inn. There was Portland, Oregon, also in a hotel at that time. I don't remember which hotel, once a month. There was Eugene, also in Oregon, once a month, where for a while, these were really incredible days, we had Mass in a Masonic Grange. It was the only place I had been able to find. Incredible. There was Pasco in the Tri-Cities, about once a month, in some inn. And there was St. Mary's of the Bitterroot Valley, south of Missoula, Montana, once a month, but it was not in the chapel yet, it was in the home of a retired airline pilot. What I do remember with such a schedule is that often when I arrived in my airplane seat at around noon on Sunday after the 2 Masses in Post Falls, in Spokane Airport, I would open my breviary and fall deep asleep at the first page. Then I would wake up sometime later, and before opening my eyes, I would challenge myself, so, did we take off yet? I wanted to look out the window. And most of the time, we were up there in the clouds with God. I didn't even feel the takeoff. I was exhausted. When I left in 1987, Portland had its church. Eugene was still in the Grange, I think. Boise was still at the Holiday Inn. And St. Mary's of the Bitterroot Valley had its tiny chapel. In June of 1985, the Johnson brothers, a whole bunch of them, of Port Townsend, Washington, invited me to join them for some fishing in Alaska so that they could have Mass during the month of work they were spending up there. They were fishing in Igigik Bay on the Aleutian Islands, a great place for fishing, commercial fishing. A short trip, about 3 days. But on the way back, I caught some good souls, not fishes, S-O-L-E, but S-O-U-L, souls, human souls, in Juneau, Stan and Dottie Belzak. That was the beginning of the Alaskan missions, June 1985, around 25th or 26th. 6 months later, after Father Ranger arrived in December 1985, we added Anchorage, and then in 1986, Fairbanks. It was going well. I was hoping to get to the very north, but it never happened. We visited these 3 missions every month for a long time. We often call these SSPX missions of the 1980s and early 90s the heroic days. And believe me, looking back, I just don't know how we did it. We were young and crazy. And our guardian angels were working double time. In September 1985, Reverend Mr. Peter LeMay from Boston, a deacon, was sent to help me and to create a community life. He stayed 4 months until December. Because in December, finally, I got an assistant priest coming from Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And this was Father Walter Ranger. He was a late vocation, a diocesan priest who came to help the Society of St. Vincent in 1984 or 85. And he was assigned to help me in Post Falls at that moment, late December 1985. And he was there when I left in 87. He has now passed away, not so long ago, 2-3 years ago. God rest his soul. I did learn a lot from him, although the roles were, unfortunately for him, upside down. He was 48 years old, a priest for about 15 years, very strong character, and I was 25, a priest for 18 months, quite hesitant and very sanguine, and I was the prior, by default, and with a lot of defects, very immature when I look back now. He had extreme patience with me, with my inexperience and youth. May he be blessed forever for that. In Coeur d'Alene, there was another priest, Father Clement Kubish, an old retired Hungarian priest. And he was truly God sent, because I could go to him for confession and could read to him my sermons in broken English, especially the first year and a half. This being said, dear Joe Malloy, who was then my secretary and accountant, would come every Monday morning or Tuesday with a list of checks to sign and a list of words from the previous sermon mispronounced or in early May 1985, we had a gracious visit of Archbishop Lefebvre with Father René, Superior. Confirmation and Mass were scheduled in the afternoon at around 3 p.m. We had lunch in that little brick house. And after lunch, I brought Father René to the church for confessions. And when I came back to the priory, the Archbishop was doing the dishes. Archbishop Lefebvre, very simple, very, very great man. Great fortitude and humility together. Incredible. As we said, in September 1984, our little country school was in the basement of the church. There were 22 students divided in two groups, 1st to 4th grade and 5th to 8th grade. A school like my dad went to back in the 1940s or late 30s and 40s. He used to speak about the little country school with all the grades in one room. And well, there it was. And I'm so pleased that one of my two former 8th grade students of that academic year, 84-85, is the one who just gave you the previous talk on this historical day. The other student was Elena Kleinsmith. I wonder if they are both grandmothers yet. Long time ago. Father Laudensteiger had hired two ladies from the area of Detroit, Michigan, the Lohr sisters, Miss Janine and Miss Lohr, as we call them, to teach that year. But only that year they returned to Michigan the following July. So at the end of the academic year 84-85, we needed a new team of teachers. More students were lining up for the fall. It was time to make a decision and consider the building of a proper school. Young and unexperienced priests can be quite ambitious, but thank God I had good advisors. I remember going to the local bank on Celtis Avenue here in Post Falls with Leonard and Joe Malloy to meet the bank manager to discuss the financial side of the project, because we did not have much in the saving account at that time. The bank manager himself encouraged us to do what he himself had done for his church, to ask for private loans for parishioners, for them at a better rate than they would get from the bank if they invested it there, and for us at a lesser rate than we would get from the bank if we borrowed from them. As a result, I do not remember having had to borrow from the bank to build Immaculate Conception Academy. Just donations and private loans. God is good, and St. Joseph is his banker. Before leaving for our first boys' camp in July 1985, we had the breaking of the ground for the school. And I remember my emotion coming back from the camp 2 weeks later, to see the big hole for the foundations of the school. The building went on at good speed, thanks to Marty Brooks and his super team of workers, and we were able to bless it on December 8th and to move in right away. The basement of the school was getting really too crowded. The school turned out to be a major blessing for the parish. As we said earlier, our Lord said, where the body is, there the eagles will be. Well, if we apply His divine wisdom, where the school is, there the families will gather. A school is really what makes a difference in the growth of a mass center. Worldwide. Schools are the greenhouses of most of our vocations today. In the Society of St. Pius X and the Dominican sisters would certainly agree. The future of the church lays in our schools. This is exactly what Cardinal Gagnon said to the Dominican sisters at the Mother House of Fangeau in France in November 1987. He had been sent by Pope John Paul II to make a canonical visitation of the works of the Society of St. Pius X. So his words are important. He was sent by the Pope. I quote, "It is with works such as these that we will rebuild the church." End of quote. Official word by the envoy of the Pope concerning our schools. And so, dear faithful, support your schools in every way you can, by your prayers and sacrifices and financially. I have mentioned the word vocations. In my short 3 years in Post Falls, one young man tried the seminary, 2 ladies the Carmel, and one, about the time I left, tried the Dominican sisters. All 4 came back. That's mystery of a vocation. But, a little baby baptized in Edmonds, mid-October, 84, he was my 4th baptism, became a priest 24 years later, Father Patrick McBride. Deo gracias. I don't know if other vocations have emerged from that period, either for the seminary or the religious life. You would know, I don't. The Divine Providence intervened in the Carmelites being established here in 1989, as Catherine will relate later today. One of our major apostolates in the Society of St. Pius X is the preaching of Ignatian retreats. This concerns the very heart of the crisis of the Church and the very heart of Archbishop Lefebvre, and thus the very existence of Immaculate Conception Church and Academy in Post Falls. If you want to understand the Society of St. Pius X, you must understand the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. The Society of St. Pius X has inherited the spiritual exercises and the technique to give the spiritual exercises from a French priest, Father Barriel, who came to Archbishop Lefebvre in the spring of 1971 as spiritual director. The society was started and was approved in November 17. So this is within that first year in Econ, first year of the society. Divine Providence sends this priest who had been given retreats in the previous 30 years to over 50,000 people in France. Thus, Providence was giving to the Society of St. Pius X a powerful tool, not just to give a spiritual life, but to form the faithful, to fight modern errors, and to restore all things in Christ. It is a tool given by Our Lady to St. Ignatius in 1521 to fight Protestantism then. And now, thanks to Father Barriel, it is given again, we're not the only one, but it is given in a particular providential way to the Society of St. Pius X in our own days to fight the neo-Protestantism invading the church. And most of our vocations have gone through the spiritual exercises before entering convents or seminaries. And so, having been a spiritual dirigé and spiritual son of Father Barriel myself, when I was at the seminary, you will then understand why we started preaching retreats as soon as it was possible. I think the first one was in Fort Flagler, near Port Townsend in Washington, near Seattle. We had one also at the home of Mrs. LG in Coeur d'Alene, next to the golf course, for about 10 ladies. Her basement was divided with bed sheets to make cells for the retreatants. It was heroic days for retreats. Some retreats were held at Dr. Guillieri's house in Bonners Ferry, further north, near Canada. The last one was held in Oregon for 49 men in the summer of 1987, near the Three Sisters. If you have never done a retreat, if you're new to tradition, check the dates online and go and see for yourself the power of this gift of God. And if you have done one or many, don't wait more than 2 years to go and do another one. Beside retreats, we started the summer camps in the Northwest. For the first 3 years, 1985 to 1987, they were held on the other side of Chicago at the little North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River for boys. In 1987, we had our first girls' camp. And I tell you, 1 week camping with 41 girls after 2 weeks with 49 boys was like heaven. The girls were incredibly good. Both were homeschoolers, obeyed at the first blow of the whistle, were dressed as angels for morning mass in these big army tents in the woods. A memorable camp, thanks to the mothers and ladies and the few men helping out. In the summer of 1986, someone showed me an ad in the Mary Faithful, the little magazine of Father Nelson in Powers Lake, North Dakota. There was a neo-Gothic wooden altar for sale that could fit very well in our little Immaculate Conception church, where a simple red curtain hung from the ceiling behind the altar. After some deliberation, we decided to go and fetch it. Chuck McDonald and I drove to Powers Lake in the Malloy Suburban and came back with a newly bought trailer, an altar, and Stations of the Cross. In the following months, it was the end of the summer, I think, the altar was restored by Patrick Kennedy in Edmonds and came back to Post Falls to the profound delight of everyone. Can't remember the exact date it was put up. However, the altar niches were still empty, all of them. And seeing the main niche empty, John Toffelmeyer, the father of Joe and Paul, the football players, donated a statue of Our Lady. But Our Lady never moves alone. She has this whole suite, she has the followers, her court. And so we found angels. They still make angels. Well, these ones were made in Chicago. And the angels happily flew to rest next to their queen and to lead souls to adore the Father in spirit and in truth in a little church in northern Idaho. That is the story of the main altar at Immaculate Conception Church. And it is most providential that the altar comes from where Post Falls' first vocation, Father Post, was ordained. A priest and an altar came from Powers Lake. Beautiful. Let us not forget Father Nelson, the founder of Powers Lake, in our prayers for what he gave to Post Falls. All this was finished by mid-March 1987. One late Sunday evening, probably March 22nd when I look at the calendar, coming back from the airport after the Sunday circuit, I stopped to make a last visit to our Blessed Lord before going to bed. And kneeling in a back pew, I was delighted at the sight of the beautiful altar. Our Lady, the angels, it was beautiful. And I said to myself, wouldn't it be funny, now that the altar is finished, that I be transferred? As it happened to many of our priests after finishing building a church or a school. My God, that will be done. Because it does happen. One plants, the other waters, and God gives the increase. Well, a few days later, towards the end of March, I remember that, I went to Phoenix to meet Father Schmidberger, our Superior General, feeling the need to meet him and to report on the apostolate in the beautiful Northwest, and to get his fatherly blessing. Father Lenné was there as well as Father Finnegan, the prior. Having arrived very late, when I saw them for the first time at the next morning breakfast, they were exchanging mysterious looks, making strange comments. Then Father Schmidberger called me to his office and announced to me my transfer to Ireland for the following August. God's will be done. Finally, just a very brief list of a few last interesting souvenirs. I remember there was this midnight visit, as I would say, a la Nicodemus, of 3 nuns from Mount St. Michael at a little teacher's house in 1985. In short, since many faithful were coming to Postfalls from Mount St. Michael, and since their best theologian, called Frater Paul, in fact, William Welsh, had left them and joined the Society of St. Pius X, some of the nuns wanted to know more about us. And the only time they found to come discreetly was at midnight one night. Unfortunately, I do not think anything came out of it. We also had this beautiful pilgrim statue of Our Lady of Fatima that came from Spain, and that went from home to home between 85 and 87. There were for a while visits to the Spokane County Jail to see a man who was a candidate to be on the list of the 15 top wanted men in the USA. The lady had asked me in the basement of the church if I ever went to jail. Well, I mean, she said, do you ever visit prisoners? And she told me the case of this man she knew who had been at the Mount and now was in jail. I did visit him and 2 others over the next months. This is an interesting apostolate that we must not forget as Catholics. Jesus speaks of it in the Gospel. I was in prison and you visited me. Some of our Legion of Mary members in Asia do that apostolate regularly. And since I'm speaking of corporal works of mercy, allow me to invite anyone, doctors, nurses, and anyone with a big heart. You don't need to have medical skills. You just need to have good hands and a bit of time a week to inquire about the Rosa Mystica medical missions taking place every year in the Philippines. 1 week of volunteer work with the poor. The next mission will be the 16th one, will be between the 6th and the 12th of March 2023. You can contact me for details at d.couture@sspx.ca. I repeat, d.couture, C-O-U-T-U-R-E, @sspx.ca, and I will put you in touch with who's in charge. Another memorable Mass was the funeral of Christine Karstetter, Jan's daughter, who died tragically in a plane accident. More than 1,000 people, mostly young people, attended that funeral in Spokane. This was no doubt the largest funeral I've ever performed in my whole life. And the famous main altar of Corpus Christi in Edmonds, which Patrick Kennedy had found and cleaned and prepared, and which was secretly put up as a last surprise just above my head during the night, Saturday to Sunday, the night of August 15 to 16, as I was sleeping in a basement that night. When I woke up the next morning, we had a new altar in the church. So I think we have covered all the essentials of these short but rather full 3 blessed years, 1984, 1987. Allow me to conclude and summarize. The grain of mustard seed has indeed become a tree where the birds of the air continue to come and to build their nest. All these people coming in, and I'm sure many of you who are listening to me are fairly new to the parish. Welcome. I wish I could meet you perhaps one day. And the story of Post Falls is truly a homage to this holy sacrifice of the Mass. The key to the growth of the parish from when I arrived in 84, let's say from 75, when the school started, but particularly 84, 85, when the school was built, the new school. The key to the growth of the parish from when I arrived in 1984 to this day was no doubt the building of the new school in 1985. And in the 1980s, we only had the primary school years, in our school. And, of course, post-fall increased so much with the arrival of our dear Dominican sisters in 1991. God indeed gave the growth. A good school only lives from the Holy Mass, around the Holy Mass, for the Holy Mass. From the Holy Mass, families settle around the altar to get the sacraments and the grace of God for all their members. Around the Holy Mass, the life of a Catholic school is punctuated by frequent masses and a liturgical year. The schoolboys provide an army of good servers for the Holy Mass. A Catholic school gives its students the spirit of sacrifice, which is the first ingredient of solid vocations as well as solid families. The finger of God continues its works here. The Immaculate is pouring graces in this, which is truly her domain. Deo gratias et Mariae. Thank you very much. God bless you all.
We're going to bring Father up on the screen to say hello. Father, we can hear you. Hopefully.
Greetings, everybody. I want to greet Bishop Ferrer, Father Fullerton, Father Diego, all the priests, sisters. I'm calling from France. We are as close to La Salette as you are from Cataldo. We're very close to the high Alps of France, the Hautes Alpes. I've been following the last two talks, the talk from Dr. Chornowski, really wonderful, and what a privilege to be called to continue the work of these great Jesuits. And let me add, what a grace to come from French Canada in the Northwest to continue to have done a few years of work there in the steps of Father Desmet and Father Ravalli. And I want to say something about to Catherine as well, who said she challenged somebody to find a church bought by auction. Well, there was one in Ireland, in Athlone, which we also bought by auction. But we did not pay $1,600. We paid about $50,000. This was an auction, nevertheless. So I'm given just a few seconds to say hello to everybody. So let us, well, God bless you all 2,000 of you now. What a wonderful mission. Father de la Tour, who was the rector of St. Mary's back in the mid-80s, in 85, when he came to Post Falls for the first time, he said, I was quite impressed. Remember, we had about 300 people then. He said, well, Post Falls will be the second St. Mary's in the U.S. one day. Well, I think it's a prophecy that is coming through from some feedback that I get. So God bless you all, 2,000 of you, and God bless, and may our Blessed Lady watch over you and increase even more. Okay, God bless everybody.
All right, so it's off to lunch for lunch break. So the next just talk is actually, but the round table will start at 1:30. So just try to get back here by 1:30. And for those that are staying here for lunch, you know who you are. We're actually in the room that's just down the room right next door to this one. So thank you.